Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody here at the auditorium and online. Welcome to our very special event today, where we have Saul Perlmutter will be talking to us about Millennium Thinking. So I'm very pleased to welcome you here and to be introducing Saul, who of course is a senior scientist here at the lab, as well as a professor of physics at UC Berkeley. And I'll say the obvious thing, in 2011, Saul shared the Nobel Prize for his discovery of the accelerating expansion of the universe. I knew of Saul's work from the early days of the supernova study, when he worked with a small group, including Carl Pennypacker and Gerson Goldhaber, and figuring out how to identify supernovas efficiently so that they could be used as a standard candle to measure the expansion of the universe. And of course, that early work developed into the Supernova Cosmology Project, which was such a spectacular success. He has also been, among many other things, founding director for the Berkeley Institute for Data Science. He currently serves as a member of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, PCAST, which has a very important role. And here, what we're going to hear about today, his interest in scientific style critical thinking led to the development of some interdisciplinary courses. I think physics and music was one, but then sense and sensibility and science, which is what this is based on, which he's been talking to undergraduates about with his colleagues. And so this is the introducing the book, Third Millennium Thinking, Creating Sense in a World of Nonsense, and the subject of his talk today. Please join me in welcoming Saul Perlmutter to the stage.
I'll try this. Okay. So good afternoon, well, good morning, and hello to those who are online. I thought I would just give you a little bit of a feel for the origin of this work, and then what it's trying to do. And I should say that it's actually very much of an LBL story, because I think the instigation of all this happened more than 10 years ago, when I was noticing, or as many of us have over the years, how poor our society is at making rational decisions about items that seem like they really are just a simple practical question, and they turn into what seemed like religious wars. So you end up with topics like what's the right level for the debt ceiling in a society, and you watch those conversations going on, and it doesn't look like anything like the kind of conversations that you would see trying to make a decision in a lab context. I remember noticing a conversation going on at the lunch tables up at the then existing cafeteria, and thinking that just the vocabulary that's used and the way that people think through problems just felt so different. And I was trying to figure out, well, where is it that we learn that whole approach? And it's not taught, as for scientists, it's not taught in any physics, biology, chemistry course that I know of, in general. And it seems that it's more of an apprenticeship kind of activity. And so the question is it possible to take what is taught through the course of going through graduate research and postdocing and young faculty roles by the culture around us? And is it possible to just articulate what are these ideas, and could they be taught? So that was the origin of it. And so I always picture the cafeteria actually when I'm imagining what was I comparing to the public conversation. So the question then came, could we teach this? And so I went to campus and was asking, well, it's probably not good enough just to give the ideas that I would think of as a physicist. I probably need some other people involved in the conversation. So I found a social psychologist in the public policy school, Rob McCohen, who's listed here, and a philosopher, John Campbell. And we started talking together about, well, what would a course consist of? And we ended up putting up a sign saying, are you embarrassed watching our society make decisions? Come help invent a course, come help save the world. And about 30 people started showing up on Fridays at the end of the afternoon. And we would get together around 4 o'clock and would go on, often past dinner time. And we would meet repeatedly went on for like 9 months. And the idea was, first we were trying to ask, what would a bare minimum set of ideas be that might be interesting to try to teach as a vocabulary to think with? And then are there ways to teach it where students could get it and then they would start seeing it in the world around them in, when they read newspapers, when they're trying to make decisions about their own lives. And so we ended up coming up with I think it was about 23 concepts that we thought actually made a good starting set. And then we developed ways to try to teach it. And then we started teaching it that next year. So now there's been 10 years of this. And the students, somebody stopped me in the street yesterday to say that they thought that it really just changed entirely how they thought about their undergraduate career and what they want to do afterwards. And so you get very strong positive responses. Of course, it's a self-selected group that chooses to take this course. The course is called Sense and Sensibility in Science. And then, of course, it raises the question over the years whether any of the students are reading Jane Austen anymore. So we might need to come up with another name. But the basic elements that I'll describe are all ones that I think you would immediately recognize because you're of the same culture. So the book and the course then is beginning with a lot of the elements of the scientific culture, which are the skeptical elements that we've learned over generations, that it's really, really easy for humans to fool themselves, and that we've learned to watch out for very specific ways that we tend to fool ourselves, and then to try and come up with ways that might somewhat scaffold our activities so we don't do it again. And these can be trivial things for this group, like random noise looks like patterns much more than anybody would expect. And so that we've all learned that when you see a peak on the graph, you don't get too excited until you actually do some statistics and you try to figure out, is that just what you'd expect from random noise? There's the whole range of ways that gets elaborated as we get used to the look elsewhere effect, that if you ask too many questions of the same data, you'll eventually up the statistics, the odds of random noise looking like something you were looking for. There's all the elements of what happens when you try to figure out what causes what, and what are causal relationships. And of course, that's where in some parts of science, they've just ruled out almost any evidence except randomized control trials. And so we have to explain, to most people what a randomized control trial was and what it's trying to help you with. But of course, in most of our lives, we don't have the opportunity of doing randomized control trials. And of course, in certain fields like cosmology, it's very difficult. So you're asking then, well, what are the other ways to tell what causal relationships are? And there are principled ways to approach that. There's the set of Hill's criteria is one of the ways that people have described it. But there are often ways of triangulating in on evidence for causal connections. And so we discuss that, and we give a feeling for how you have to be on your guard for ways you'll be fooled with respect to that. So, and then we do a lot of discussion about just probabilistic thinking in general, which is to what extent do people usually like to work with either things that are definitely true or definitely not true. And that's, of course, not the way most scientists work, that we tend to take full advantage of the fact that we have some more confidence in some parts of the story and some less confidence in other parts of the story. And we are able to work with those kinds of data if we keep track. And so we do spend some time having students get used to the idea that when you're having an argument or a discussion with somebody and you're putting out elements of your argument, you might actually try to give us some sense of what is your confidence in that element. Are you 99.999% sure of this particular element? You bet your life on it, and it's like you bet your life every time you get on an airplane that many tons of metal will fly. And so there are things that we will take with 99.9999% confidence, but there are other things that we would still make some use of when we're only 85% sure. But just stating that in the course of the argument makes it a little bit more of a shared experience, because you then have to actually take seriously the possibility that 15% odds that maybe you're wrong in this particular item. And then how does that change the rest of the flow of the argument? Would you consider something different if it turns out that 15% is right? So that was that whole probabilistic thinking element seemed like it was a very much of a key tool that we use as scientists, and we just take for granted in many cases. But it doesn't sound like a lot of the way arguments are done, outside of this outside the scientific context. After we've dealt with all this skeptical part of sciences, all the ways in which we can go wrong, it was important to recognize that there's another aspect of the scientific culture that's often not articulated, which is that we don't just have the brake pedal of not fooling ourselves. We also need the accelerator pedals of how do you actually take on big problems and work on them. And we're trying to sort of capture that sense of something that we're calling scientific optimism, that most people, when asked, what's the longest, when we said, what's the second longest you've ever spent trying to figure out a puzzle or problem, people can think of hours they've spent, they can think of maybe days they spent, but they don't usually jump to months, years, and decades. And yet, as everybody here probably would immediately be able to say, many really important problems that you care about take much longer to solve than I think most ordinary human attention span would allow for. And so there is this culture of science, which is a bit of a can-do culture that allows us to fool ourselves into thinking that we can solve a problem long enough so we can actually solve it, to stick with it long enough. And so we discussed that element of the scientific effort, and then also just some of the practical tools that makes it possible to take on complicated big problems, like the fact that we can parse problems into what is the first order issue here, what are the second order and third order things that maybe you don't need to take into account at the beginning. I realized that after a while, when I was explaining the first order to first order, there's this part of the problem. I realized that over the years that my wife later said to me she didn't know what we were talking about, and that it was not part of the common vocabulary, and that of course around here I think probably people would use the phrase without even thinking about it. So that was it's actually something to articulate and to think about, parsing problems that way, so people don't waste all their time over something that's a shiny aspect of the problem, but it just doesn't matter. It's just not that important. And then, of course, that comes along with being able to do back-of-the-envelope calculations and Fermi problems for physicists, that you are able to make a quick estimate as to, is this thing even plausibly important? Maybe even more important during a period where we're all constantly looking things up on the internet, and there are all sorts of numbers there that you may actually want to be able to just do a quick sanity check. Does this make any sense at all? And so that was one of the other elements that we were teaching that part of the course. Finally, we then put all these elements of that I think make sort of rational decision making into the context of what happens when humans really approach a decision. And then we had to deal with all the things that Danny Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow has presented, all the ways in which the human cognitive style tends to use all sorts of shortcuts that are not always right, but they're very patterned, and so you can watch out for them. And so it was important to be aware of them. And then what happens when groups of people try to make a decision, and the ways in which you can fall into herd thinking, or the ways in which you can get the best of the wisdom of the crowds, and what things tend to lead to one, and what things tend to lead to the other. So that was the sort of the next element of the story. And then finally, we felt it was really important to ask, when you make a decision, it's not just the rational elements that are driving the decision. In fact, they're only the facilitator of being effective in the decision. What's driving it is the fact that people have goals, they have fears, they have desires, but they have values as well that they're trying to satisfy in making a decision. And if you don't come up with a principled way to combine all the values and the fears and the goals with all these techniques of rationality that we're describing, the part that will get left out is the rationality, not the fears and goals and values, because those are the things that brought people into the room to make a decision in the first place. So that meant that we couldn't just say, well, that's not our problem, how you're going to combine it. We're teaching the rationality. We felt that it was really important to also start to work on what does it take to weave all those together. And so that was actually, it became a fairly large part of the last quarter of the course, and also a large part of the book. discussing what are the techniques that people have invented and developed over the years that look like they're useful for this purpose, and could we take advantage of them? So that's the general feel of the elements of the story and the book. But what we hope that this delivers at the end is something that adds up to something a little bit more in the times that we live in, where I think people are not aware of how much we're leaving on the table because of the degree of polarization and logjam that we're facing, and that it seems like a very interesting moment in history that we are all finding ourselves in, where in some ways, it's one scarier moments, I think, for everybody's very aware, and our internet is very good at delivering us all the fears of every way in which that we could ruin our planet. We could, people can be ruining each other's lives. And the fears are very salient. But at the same time, this is actually probably the first time in history where you could, with a straight face, look around and say, if we were able to work together on a few more things, we, in principle, could be building a planet where, we could actually feed, clothe, house, educate everybody. That people, and we could live in a planet that we would just be proud to live in. And so we could be living at a time when everybody was looking at each other and saying, this is our moment to develop the capacity to thrive together into the future. We're not only that, but we're probably the first beings on the planet, as far as we know, who had the possibility of staving off the next time we get hit by a comet and everything gets devastated, and with mass extinctions. We've actually, tested the possibility of nudging a incoming asteroid out of the way. So in some ways, we're much more capable, I think, than most people realize. We are capable of doing damage, that we can create a climate change that we don't want to live through. But that also shows how we are actually working at a global scale where we can actually fix things when they go wrong in a way that no species ever could before. We could actually control our planet's environment. So we were hoping that people would come out of this with that sense that if they could just talk to each other a little bit more effectively, and that's the whole end of this book, and use some of those techniques of deliberating together. And if we have time later today, I'll describe some of the ones that I thought were most inspiring. Then there's a real motivation here, because we actually could be not living in a zero-sum world where people are just fighting with each other to hold on to the bits they've got and are living in fear, but we could be living in a world where people are building something together and expanding the pie and finding a world that you don't have to give too many things up in exchange for something else, and that people can help each other rather than be trying to get into their corners and hold on. So watching another round of a highly polarized election season, we're feeling like it would be very nice if there was some sort of other view of how people could come together. And we're particularly emphasizing the fact that there's, among all the ways to recover from fooling yourself and the ways you go wrong, one of the things that science has actually developed is the capability of working with people you disagree with, and that you actually need the people you disagree with. And that's been one of the whole traditions, that people give each other a hard time at seminars. I'm expecting people to give me a hard time, after this. And because you have to kick the tires and you have to figure out where the problems are. And it's very hard to do it with just people who already agree with you. And so, a society that's going to really thrive is, I think, a society that does reach out and find the people who you think of as that other half of the population that you couldn't possibly talk to. And you have to talk to them because they're the ones who will be able to help you catch the places that you're going wrong. So anyway, that's the final element I just want to throw in at this moment in our both our history, but also this moment in our highly polarized society. So maybe I should pause there for questions.
Okay, well, sure. Okay, that was great. And so, yeah, there are lots of familiar problems to all of us who work in experimental physics in that. And so part of it is, as you've talked about, we both have the process of working with big teams, digging into looking for difficult evidence out of lots of data with confounding systematics. and having this really robust discussion about. But in the end, and part of what we do is teach our students how hard it is to avoid fooling yourself when doing this. And so actually, in thinking about the story of the supernova, that must have been going on there all the time, right? Because that was the opposite of confirmation bias. You ended up with something. You ended up at a place not where you started at all. So you might talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, I think that example actually ended up being a very nice one to show people that you don't always do this right. I mean, that even when you're trained in all this, and that it's aspirational, and that we get it wrong all the time, and so we're constantly needing each other to help figure out where we're making the mistakes, at any given moment. So when people say, "Yeah, but scientists, don't do this," we say, they don't always do this, but that's where they at least are embarrassed when they don't do it right. The supernova case, I like telling the slightly embarrassing story that once we actually saw this acceleration and expansion of the universe, we went back and looked at the early pilot study we had done, where the error bars were too big to be able to differentiate, but it certainly didn't look like it was homing in on the accelerating story that we ended up with. And I went back to the data to try and figure out, well, what were we seeing then? And I came to the conclusion that that there was at least one data point where we had worked on it and worked on it and worked on it, and then stopped working on it when it got an answer that we sort of thought might be the right answer. And this is the classic confirmation bias that we describe, causing the whole field of particle physics, and then now we brought it into the cosmology to start using blind analysis, because there's this real temptation that you're going to look for all the bugs in your software, you're going to look for all the weaknesses in your analysis. When you see a plot that just looks strange, it's going to be embarrassing to show at the next conference, but you stop at the point where your grad student says, "I got to go to the conference, does this look okay?" And they say, "It looks fine," unless you have some principled way to figure out where the stopping rule is, where you're supposed to stop looking for the bug that's not when it looks fine to you. And at that time, we had gone back through, actually just a little bit earlier, we'd gone back through other analyses by the other competing team at the time, or competing teams, and had seen real evidence that they had gotten measurements wrong. And we're trying to figure out, well, how come it didn't change the answer? And it turned out that the calibration had also been, of the Hubble Space Telescope, had been wrong. And when those two were there, the answer came out to be the same thing that you expected. And so we were feeling rather smug about the fact that, look what they did, until we did this analysis of our own data. And we came to the conclusion that I don't think I'm going to trust anything anymore unless there's some degree of blinding going in.
Yeah. So also another part in the book, you talk about, as you reach to these sort of larger decision makings, have in each part of it, first you start with what the principles are that society operates by, but then you have to, for each outcome, you have to break it into what's the science tell you, and then what your values tell you about the outcome. Now that depends, and then that you'd like to think that then the science, you can have the scientist actually bring some expertise to. Now, in cosmology, it's easy to convince people that there's some objective science there, that wherever you are in the universe, you'll find the same expansion. In biomedical science, perhaps not so much, or in atmospheric modeling, in climate modeling, not so much, and so in some of these other fields of science, it's harder to convince the public that there really is an objective science, that if you can do the work right. Have you run into that? I'm sure you've run into that discussion.
No, absolutely. And of course, I think that this is where this issue of the decision-making procedure of a group intersects with that topic of probabilistic thinking. And that the expertise that you're looking for is not the expertise to say, this is the truth. I can promise you that that this will be the number of degrees of warming you'll get for this amount of carbon. You want the scientists who can tell you, here are the probabilistic elements of what we currently understand, and do it in some way that you can actually use that, and that you can actually say, well, okay, if that's the case, I'm going to have to make a decision based on which odds am I willing to accept. But I think even just that first step of being able to separate out which part of the problem is just reality, that it's going to do what it's going to do no matter what you want to do, versus which parts are choices and decisions of priorities and values. That separation alone already helps make the conversations very different.
So, and this gets back to the trust for science and society is very much tied into this. Now, we were both working on a group talking about AI in science. We did this last year exercise, and one of the issues there is, okay, and this thing about convincing people that science is trustworthy. Now we're entering an era where AI is going to infuse all of science. Is it going to be harder to convince people that this AI has been used as a tool, that science is actually objective and something that we can trust?
My sense is that there's different ways in which we use AI. In fact, you made a very good point when we were all meeting together for this, which was that for a group like this, we use the term AI to include things that are not these language models, large language models.
Not ChatGPT.
Right.
I mean, that's mostly not what we're doing. Yeah.
So that, for many things we're doing, we do all the same tests that we would do for anything. And of course, that will be the rigor that we would have to show for publication, but also we hope for the public audience. I think that your point, though, does apply especially to the fact that the ChatGPT style of large language models provides another whole route for the misinformation to appear on the internet.
Well, even for the scientific community to convince itself that you're reaching the same standards of reproducibility that you've always had, that's still ahead of us. We still have to be able to show that.
No, absolutely. And I think any paper that's going to depend on this is going to have to do all the usual rigorous things to show how do we do the sanity checks, how do we do the cross checks, make sure that what we're doing. But that's something that the science papers always have to do.
We always have to do it, and it's not really a different problem.
I mean, in that sense, I mean, it's a new variant of it, but we always have to do that.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe we can time to take some questions from out there. So would we like to? Yeah.
Hello. Thank you so much, Professor. I do enjoy your talk, and then thank you for sharing your thoughts. I have a question. Reading this book briefly, you shared quite a few techniques and then toolkits, such as to distinguish the patterns from noise, and also the confidence level, etc., to help formulate a better decision making. And also during your talk, you mentioned for us as a human being, we're complicated and everybody is unique. I think you and Director Mike touched on this point, but when we make decision, we wanted to fit in our purpose and our mission in life. So when the decision from the process or from the toolkit kind of differs from what my gut's feeling, how do I, as a human being, reconcile that? Am I better off just to delegate my decision-making authority to AI? I wonder where we're going next. And thank you.
I think this is very much the question of the values and the priorities and the choices, right? Those are really the things that you have to be constantly doing every day when you're making your own personal decisions, and that doesn't change as you bring in expertise into the story. What the expertise provides is it makes it possible for those decisions to be effective in the world. So you could, as a personal preference, is I would like to be able to fly, flap my wings and fly across the country. Obviously, in fact, practically speaking, that's not possible. But you want the equivalent. You want to know what things you're choosing to do and what things you're not choosing to do are really effective in the world. And so then you really need to know what causes what are things made out of, and in the world around you for certain kinds of decisions. So I think that's the usefulness of the scientific expertise in the story. Now, you don't give up all conversation when you get to the priorities and the values. There, you probably also want to talk to people. It's just that it's a very different conversation. There, you're asking people to give you good examples of where it is that you might actually have chosen to prioritize something different than what you're currently prioritizing, and maybe for your long-term personal interests versus your short-term interests, or for other people's interests. But that's a very useful conversation. It's just that it's good to be able to recognize when you're having one or the other, to the extent that they are separable. They're not always separable.
Okay.
So when you were discussing the kind of language, the common language in a scientific community, it's something I certainly resonate with as well. But I also find myself code switching a lot when I leave the scientific community. And I see this kind of disconnect between the language that I use at work and the language I use at home. And it makes me think about the kind of culture war against elitism that takes place on TV, on the internet, and things that kind of directs a lot of malice towards like the kind of university crowd. And this book seems like, at least from your description, like a way to try to maybe teach the non-university world a bit of our language. But I wonder if there's equal importance in kind of us learning the language of the non-academic world a bit better, and to without being condescending or anything like that, but try to speak in a way that is more relatable to people outside of this kind of knowledge bubble.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, and I think that there's actually been a whole tradition of for the scientists to be trying to find ways to learn how to communicate in a accessible, manner. With some ups and downs, I think we saw, for example, in the pandemic, that some ways of trying to say things simply enough that you thought it would get across, I think probably were not the right ones to use, and we might have wanted a little bit more of the sort of nuance that we're talking about here. I'm thinking in particular about not speaking probabilistically or speaking about iterative of understanding of a problem, but saying that we just have to be absolutely definitive, and then a few weeks later, we have to be definitive another way. And I think that was obviously a bit of a failure of an attempt to move towards a non-scientific style of speech. So I think that you really do want the two sides to come together. I just hadn't seen as many examples of trying to get the public to be aware that there is a language there, and that even the educators of the world, who are teaching the sciences, I don't think have really realized that they're also potentially teaching a whole language of problem solving and decision making, irrespective of whether they're teaching math, physics, biology, chemistry, and that this is something that we want to be able to recognize and we want to be able to do. I should also add that we've started to ask what ages and where should this be taught. I mean, to some extent it should be taught, what you'd probably like our judges to have remedial courses in this, and occasionally have, when you talk to your doctor, you would like them to be able to speak a little bit more in some of this language than they usually are trained for. But there's also the other end, which is, there's no reason you would want to wait till college to take this kind of course. And so we're starting to work on a high school version of the course with the Lawrence Hall of Science educators, and actually the Nobel Prize Foundation is working with us so they can spread it internationally to the to various different school systems around the world, since that's one place that people go to for their curriculum material without waiting for a school board to agree.
Yeah, and I'd say there are a couple of parts of this about scientists talking to the larger world, and there's one that several of us have long experience with in the academic community, scientists talking to humanists and social scientists and philosophers and so forth, and that's one level. In fact, because of my situation, I have a humanist PhD I'm married to for a long time, so we have that discussion at dinner. You may know something about that too.
Yep.
And that's something we're used to. And it's a rich discussion, but then there's this other one that I think is more recent to us, realizing the disconnect between the way the academic world approaches anything from the non-academic world. And that's in some sense that's a harder bridge to cross. And so I think that's where a lot of effort in recent times is. It's not these little infightings between the academic community, it's how do we reach the people who really don't connect with the academic community. Dan,
So I have a question from the virtual audience. When dealing in public issues relating to policy or other social questions, I often find the most difficulty talking about uncertainty. We as scientists always have an error bar on our measurements, but it's hard to communicate with the general public that a single experiment will give a variety of possibilities. Do you have any suggestions for talking about uncertainty and noise in these important policy topics?
And political polling, you might ping that too.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I think everybody got this crash course in this during the pandemic, right? At one point, not to mention the surprising crash course when the first time when Trump was elected, and people realized that, oh, when there's a probability below 50%, that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. So I think that the question, of course, is one that is a constant one for science communication, and people are constantly trying to figure out ways to do it. Personally, I'm always attracted to the ones that have to do with finding the places that people are already using probabilistic language and are already thinking in that style. And sports is obviously one for a big fraction of our society. You would think America would have a real advantage because we happen to have one sport where that's almost the entire game. The baseball had that long tradition. But I was struck by this, during the pandemic, just to go back to that example, where one of the analogies that could have been used very early on was that we aren't going to give you one football play for the entire pandemic, and we're just going to play that same play over and over again every down for the whole game. We're going to have to adjust our play depending on what the opponent is doing. The virus is going to be changing what it does. We don't even know what it's trying to do, and we have to watch what the other team is doing, and then coming up with new strategies every time. I think that would have been a perfectly fine analogy that most people would have gotten in the United States. Nobody else plays football or American football, but I think that style of presentation, I think, has a fighting chance, and so I'd love to see that.
Yeah, in fact, if people really understood statistics, for the most part, they couldn't actually operate as a sports writer, for the most part, because as almost all things, at some point I was looking at the NFL, and you could actually go with the idea that all the teams were exactly the same, and it was just random about how much separation there were. And of course, if you had that much idea about this, you couldn't write these articles about that show that this had to happen the way it happened. I mean, so it's almost a requirement to be a really compelling sports writer that you don't believe in statistical fluctuations. But it is the only place actually where this comes in sort of everyday life, because if people, well, and that's one thing about sports betting, it really does make people think probabilistically. So do we have another?
Hi. I had a question about basically in how far you think teaching this methodology really is effective through like a university course or a book, because we learn it very passively as scientists, I guess, but actively learning a method of thinking, I think, is a totally different thing. And I don't know if someone doesn't grow up in an academic, like, I don't know in how far this will actually be effective. And then I have a second question. In an absolute ideal world where people would be thinking more accordingly to what you suggest, could you give like a probabilistic idea of how effective you then think this would be?
All right, so let me try a couple of these things. So we had exactly that same concern when we first were developing the course. And so what we actually early on is we got a grant from the Moore Foundation to bring in some professionals to help us develop assessments to tell, are people getting any of this stuff? We have all these different learning goals and all these different things we're trying to teach. Are they getting it? And so we ended up developing a whole series of assessments, essentially. And then we did start doing before and after testing. And from the early parts of that, you could certainly see big shifts. In fact, in terms of of people be able to, use these things in that test setting, they generally went from wherever they were when they came into the course, they got halfway to the best score by the end. So that was, that seemed good. But we were very much interested in the question of, does it generalize? And so, a lot of the questions that we tried to develop were ones where you would look for it in some setting in the natural world around them. Can you recognize it when you see it in a newspaper article? Can you recognize it when you see it about a decision you're trying to make about what to eat or a doctor's advice? And so, and then all the teaching tools were all trying to do games and activities that were after capturing that, not just lecturing to them and then hoping they got it. So that was very much the feel of what we've been doing. What we have not, and I can report that we have anecdotally, people still write to us and say they're still using these ideas, even 8 years, 9 years later, and then we get postcards from people saying they want to know they're running for a state assembly, and that they're doing it because they were convinced by things we were doing. So all that's great for anecdotal, but we have not yet been able to do the long-term longitudinal studies that you really need to do to find out more about that. We are right now talking, I don't know if people know the PISA education assessments that are done to compare. Those are the ones whenever you read about the comparisons of how, Finland's ahead of everybody and then Germany and then, et cetera, they're using the PISA assessments. So the PISA people got very interested in this. And right now they're preparing PISA 2029, and they're working with us now to see whether they can build in these kinds of assessments into PISA 2029. And we think that may drive some of the education in the upcoming years, because then people will feel like they've got to figure out how to teach this stuff if it's going to be on the tests.
Hi, Saul. Thank you for this. And I thought your mention of talking about how you have to watch the other team is a good explanation of why scientists change their mind in the middle of a problem like the pandemic. I thought that was brilliant. Can you speak to other challenges we have about specific policies? And I'll throw out gun violence or climate change to tell us how you think this could change and help out. But you can pick whichever one you think.
So I'd say the most immediate reaction, I think, to I would have, to all this kind of optimistic sounding claim is that, but look, realistically, in the world we live in, people don't seem to be able to have these conversations, right? And they don't seem to be making progress together. We seem to be seeing mostly further polarization and further separation, at least in our recent lifetimes. And so, what would make one think that something could be done that would take advantage of all this? And in particular, when you talk about climate change or gun control or whatever it would be. So the example, and some of the examples I thought were most interesting to read about that we actually discussed in the course, and then we demonstrated, we tried out, is there's this technique that's been used for civic assemblies now around the world. Most places, including some states in the United States, it's been done for certain kinds of policy decision making, which is a technique that's sometimes called deliberative polling. And the concept here is that you don't want to find a self-selected group to get together when you have a town hall meeting, for, let's say, a city council. You don't want the self-selected group of the people who come, who already know what the answer is, and they just, keep saying their answer over and over again. You want a truly random sample of the population. And so that's what these events do. They actually collect a truly random sample. They bring them together to deliberate. They really work very hard to, they provide childcare, they pay for people's time, they fly them, they pay for their flights, and they do everything they can to get like 95% response rates, completely unlike a poll, which gets nowadays, 10, 15%, and they try to extrapolate from that. And then they also look at, have they gotten all the demographics well sampled, and they try to make sure that it's a true representative group. And then they start them deliberating in smaller groups. So typically for, let's say, the United States, it could be 600 people that you bring together or something that size, depending on how many questions you're going to ask. And then they start deliberating in smaller groups. But what happens is that, of course, most random people don't know the answers to many things that you need to know while you're trying to think about a question like, should we be fracking for natural gas? Should we, what policies for climate change should be taking advantage of? So what you do is you also bring in a panel of experts that represent actually many points of view. And they then answer the questions whenever these deliberative groups get stuck. And so you go back and forth between the deliberation and the questions to the experts, and then more deliberation and more questions to the experts. And the experience apparently is, from what I've been hearing from those who organize these, that people take this very seriously. It's a little bit like the way they get engaged in a jury, as they describe it, and that people do change their minds on topics in a way that you would not expect their leaders to be able to change their minds very easily, because they are, they're representing a viewpoint. And they change their minds not primarily based on who's the most charismatic speaker in the group, but apparently based on what facts they've learned over the course of the time. The experts may disagree with each other, but the groups deliberate then and talk about, well, that person seems a little bit more believable for this reason and that reason. And they seem to be able to do some reasonable thinking through in a way that you might not have expected. And you hear, and so I went to an event where there was the people who were running this it's getting built into the legislative process in a number of countries now. So Ireland has been very much in the forefront of this. They've been using it for a number of years, and people are very much happy to join in both the government in asking for a deliberative event and the population in participating in it. But other countries, France, Denmark, I think Canada, they've all been working on it. EU has started to work with it. And what they reported, all of them, was that they were struck by how at the end of the process, everybody who was engaged in it said that they were really pretty apolitical when they came in. They just hadn't really paid that much attention on average. But they came out feeling really energized, and they said, everybody should do this. This is really important. And many of them then started running for public office and getting involved in politics afterwards. So apparently it was something that people actually enjoy doing at the end of the day, and they felt that it was a very fair process. So the one in France, for example, that they did, I gather most recently, was one where they were looking at the question of should they implement a assisted suicide law for terminally ill. And coming in, apparently, it was a fairly lopsided starting point, that the public and the representative group both were probably 75% in favor, 25% against. But for the purpose of deliberation, they tried to make sure that people deliberate with real attention to listening to each other and following through the conversation. And at the end, they did come forward with a recommendation for to go to the legislature of a law that would allow for some form of assisted suicide. But one of the people raised their hands and stood up and said, I just should let you know that I'm of the group that thinks this is a bad idea, and I still think it's a bad idea. They said, however, the process that we just did was so well done, and everybody really did think through all of our arguments, that I will support this recommendation going forward, because I think that was the right way to make that decision together. And so that kind of result is, I think, what we'd be looking for. Now, the United States is way behind in this activity. It was used actually by the Public Utility Commission in Texas about 15, 20 years ago. They were trying to decide where investments should be for the future of energy. And at the time, they didn't trust it. So they ran 3 complete independent deliberative polls. And all 3 of them actually came to the same recommendations. So based on that, they ended up going for a mix of energy sources. And Texas went from being the last in the country in wind power to being the first in the country in wind power over the next 10 years. So it has happened in the United States. Now, of course, lately, it doesn't feel like the Texas mix of how they're managing their energy has been quite as impressive. I don't know whether it's at all connected, but anyway, so these are the reasons why I think there is some room for optimism, that there is something that we could do if we were not in these current polarized struggles of our leaders.
Maybe, Dan, we have.
We have a couple here
Oh,
waiting
okay.
on from our virtual audience. So this is one where our questioner is asking you, Dr. Perlmutter, for your thoughts on the following. We cannot think of every avenue about a problem that we're trying to solve. In other words, we don't know what we don't know. So in the absence of full knowledge, we may be making decisions based on partial information. How do we overcome that?
I mean, I think we are always doing that. And, even as scientists, that's...
And as humans, I mean, most of us live our lives with impartial imperfect knowledge about how things will turn out.
And so, but I think that one thing
Yeah.
we've learned, as scientists is that it's an iterative process, right? We never think we're finished. That there's always something more that we have to figure out, and we have to revisit it and then try to improve. And so, the decisions that we make as personal decisions and as a society should always, well, may not always, but generally, they should come with sort of an expectation that you will constantly be revisiting. Okay, how did that work? And should something do we have more information now than we did before, so we can actually make a better decision than we did when we were completely we had no idea, let's say, how the COVID worked.
Well, and when we made our career decisions, how clueless we were about how that was really going to work, right? I mean, I think most of us have that experience.
Exactly.
But we do the best we can, and I think there is the part of constantly refining how much we know.
And that's, I think, really been
Yeah.
a big tradition of science. That business of that we're not doing one fell swoop. We're doing a lot of iterative improvement.
Yeah. So Lauren had a question here. So.
I'm curious what kind of new directions your students may be taking these concepts or this work, and if there is one thing you would like us to share with others about this concept or this work after we leave today.
So the students that I've spoken to, seem to be very much. I think they really do like, and they do get the probably the big picture of what we're trying to do with this style of teaching, which is to be comfortable with the idea that you don't have to hug every idea and for that matter every value as part of your identity. That it's very useful to be able to hold it at just a little bit of a distance and walk around it with other people and figure out what does I really think about this, and that's not a sign of detachment and not caring. That's actually real diligence. That's really that you really do care, and so you're going to try to hold it just far enough away to be able to think about it together. And I think that the students coming out of it seem to have really picked up that message, and they see now science as being something much more, for them, much more fun. And for those who aren't going into the science, they see it as part more of their daily lives, just in terms of providing this ability to think about problems together. And the other part of the problem was, one thing, maybe that's it. I mean, maybe it's the fact that that you want to be able to look at things, and everything shouldn't be a giving up of all your personal sense of self. If just the fact that you're holding it at a little bit of a distance, you're asking, do I really think that priority is more important than that priority for the value side? Or what happens if what I thought was factually true, what happens if this turns out to be the 20% of the time that it's wrong? And how will that change what we have to do? And how can I be flexible enough to be able to handle that? So I think that might be the one takeaway that I would love people to have without feeling like that's not showing a sense of commitment and caring and passion.
Yeah. And I think related to this, I think part of the thing one's trying to get past is so many people choose their decision. People like me don't think that. They think this. People like me. So it's actually, how they fit in their group requires them to think a certain way. And the hard part, and the thing that I think as scientists we try to bring to this is not having that approach. You actually have to, don't do it just because all your friends have this. Actually, this is stepping back a bit and saying, why do we think this and what should we think? The hard part is getting people not to just think with their group. That's the hardest thing.
And to the extent that we've seen these examples where people somehow start to identify with the problem solving, not with the group, like that's one of the things I think the deliberative poll was striking about, or juries can have that effect.
Okay, I think that's probably a good place to end on, actually, with that one thing to do. So let's thank Saul. Okay, and go out into the world and spread the word. Okay, thank you.